Here we're going to look at blood components. Now, if you've ever had blood drawn and put into a vial, you notice it's this kind of dark red liquid. And you may think, oh, it transports oxygen. There's actually different components that we're going to investigate further so you can develop a greater understanding for the components that make up blood. Of those components, there's four major ones we're going to focus on. One is plasma, and that's the liquid portion that contains dissolved nutrients, hormones, and gases, and comprised about 55% of the total blood. The red blood cells, or erythrocytes, they're the ones responsible for transporting oxygen and also carbon dioxide. White blood cells, or leukocytes, are important for the body's immune system, and platelets help the body form blood clots. This is what it will look like after a centrifuge, and you can see there's definitely a distinctive yellow, clearish to whitish region, and then the dark red portion. Now, blood is the body's only fluid tissue. It's got a metallic taste, it's kind of sticky. It goes from a scarlet red to a dark red. Never is blood a blue color. Its pH is kept in a tight range between 7.35 and 7.45. Its temperature is slightly higher than normal body temperature, and it accounts for approximately 8% of the body's weight. For males, it's about 5 to 6 liters of blood. For females, about 4 to 5 liters. That plasma that I mentioned, that kind of yellow portion, blood plasma contains over 100 solutes, including proteins, non-protein nitrogenous substances, organic nutrients, electrolytes, and respiratory gases, and is that yellowish kind of color to it. So it contains everything from sodium, potassium, glucose, lactic acid, clotting proteins, oxygen, carbon dioxide. A whole bunch is found in blood plasma. Formed elements, so erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets make up the formed elements. Only white blood cells are complete cells. Red blood cells actually have no nuclei or organelles, and platelets are just cell fragments. We see those here. Most formed elements survive in the bloodstream only a few days. Most blood cells do not divide, but are renewed by cells in the bone marrow. This gives you a little kind of comparison of what they kind of look like here. The erythrocytes are the red blood cells, about 99% of the blood cellular component. They're biconcave discs because this gives them a very high surface area to volume ratio, and very important for the nutrient as well as gas exchange that they're so needed to do. They're also an anucleate, which means they lose their nucleus at maturity and have essentially no organelles. They're filled with hemoglobin, which is a protein that functions for gas transport, responsible for the red color. And as they move through the circulatory system here, they have a special protein that helps give them flexibility, so they're able to move through the veins and the arteries quite well. And they can change shape as necessary, but they will always kind of maintain overall that biconcave disc to allow a high surface area to volume ratio. Erythrocytes are red blood cells' lifespan. They live about 4 months. Iron from hemoglobin is recycled in the liver and spleen. And the hormone erythropoietin is made in the kidneys, and it stimulates the production of red blood cells in the bone marrow. One red blood cell contains about 1 billion molecules of oxygen. Kind of some fun facts here. Red blood cells take about 20 seconds to circulate over the body one time, and they circulate for about 120 days. There's millions of red blood cells in one drop of blood, and 2 to 3 million red blood cells are made each second. So I'm not going to go too much into the detail of the lifespan, but you could see red blood cells, you might be taking for granted how many there are and the necessary function that they produce. As I said, they have about 100 to 120 day lifespan. Older erythrocytes become rigid and fragile, and their hemoglobin begins to degenerate, both making them basically non-functional. During the erythrocytes are engulfed by macrophages, that's when they're dying, and they're kind of engulfed and cleaned up that way. Heme and globin are separated, and the iron is salvaged for reuse. So the body's not just going to engulf them and completely break them apart and throw them away. It's going to use some of the components. It's important to remember that red blood cells do not grow, do not divide, and do not make any new proteins. Myoglobin is a protein found in muscle cells. As you can see here, a darker red meat contains a greater amount of myoglobin. They provide oxygen to active muscles. It's very similar to something you might be more familiar with called hemoglobin, and it binds to oxygen tighter than hemoglobin, as we see here. Here's our pressure in millimeters of mercury, and we see our myoglobin shoots up very quickly, so it binds oxygen tighter than hemoglobin. We'll notice here are two different types of hemoglobin. HF is referring to fetal hemoglobin, which is a little more efficient at binding oxygen than adult hemoglobin here, but all perform the same basic function. Looking specifically at hemoglobin, it's a complex protein made up of 4 protein strands, these different peptide chains. Iron is used to form the heme groups, and that's what's responsible for the oxygen binding. Because it's a protein, shape is very important. We can see pH will also impact the ability for hemoglobin to be able to bind oxygen. So here's 7.4 and here's 7.2. A decrease in pH causes a greater release of oxygen. So at 7.4, hemoglobin is more efficient at binding oxygen than at pH 7.2. Platelets, as I mentioned, are fragments, and they do not contain a nucleus, grains, and they basically function for the clotting purposes. So you see this kind of like web here that forms. It's a mechanism by forming temporary plug that helps seal breaks in blood vessels. They also play a key role in the formation of fibrin and fibrinogen. And they're responsible for that kind of webbing, and that's what's helping block trap the red blood cells in here, preventing continuous bleeding from occurring. Kind of shows a little pictorial here of a damaged blood vessel. Injury, here's our red blood cells leaving. Activated platelets start to bind and kind of make a little plug here. And then we see our fibrin strands carrying that netting, really kind of sealing that area off from the red blood cells escaping, as well as from potential invaders from the outside of the body getting into the body in the bloodstream. There's 2 different types of anemias. There's hemorrhagic anemia, which is the result of acute or chronic blood loss, and both of these are insufficient red blood cells or hemoglobin in the body. So you could have that insufficient by just simply losing a lot of blood, or having an iron deficiency, which is a secondary result of hemorrhagic anemia. Inadequate intake of iron-containing foods can also contribute to this, and impaired iron absorption. So here we see our normal levels, we have our storage and our transport, then we have an iron depletion, and then we have iron deficiencies. And we have iron-deficient anemia, as we notice that transport and functional iron decreases at a much greater rate. You could see the suggested rates for grams per liter for females and males. Close, typically needed a little bit more for males. And this is our progressive of iron depletion. This is a much worse case than here. Sickle-cell anemia, you may have heard of that before. It's where red blood cells basically lose their biconcave disc shape and cause this sickle shape. And that's a defective gene encoding for abnormal hemoglobin. It's a single amino acid substitution, so you could see our normal protein being made here, and here's a single amino acid substitution resulting in a mutant amino acid causing a mutant protein. Its shape is changed. The defect caused red blood cells to have that sickle shape and low oxygen absorbing qualities, and also this sickle shape does not allow it to free flow through the veins and arteries as well. Lastly, we have the ABO blood groups, and it is referring to group A has A antigens, group B has B antigens, group AB has A and B antigens, and group O has no antigens. This is used to classify blood types. This is where people may say they're AB or O types. There's also could be A positive or B positive. That refers to Rh factors, which stands for rhesus factors there. So that gives you a general overview of the blood and the different components that it contains.